I'll reconvene the hearing panel for the afternoon on the rural zone, and I believe we've got verbal submissions from Environment South, and when they can beam in. Transport is not working.
There he is. You're muted.
Fiona, can you hear us? Perfect.
Good afternoon, and welcome, and we're ready to hear your submission or response to the 40.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. So introductions, my name is Marcus Woolley, Policy Government Reform Manager at Environment Southland, and I'm joined with Gavin Gilder. Gavin, introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm in the policy and planning team. And some of you will be aware I provide advice on natural hazards mitigation to people looking at building and subdividing, etc., for insurance queries.
So I'll start off with the RPS background, and then Gavin will be able to talk a bit more detail around the Tonkin and Taylor report that makes up part of the package that's part of this hearing. So I guess, predominantly the Environment Southland submission deals with the regional policy statement matters. So jumping into the natural hazards sections of the regional policy statement, natural hazard policy 3 through 6, I guess, are the ones we're looking at today. 3 and 4, well, 3 is a precautionary approach, but I really want to focus in on 4. I think natural hazard policy 4, the RPS is the key one around planning and building, making plans. 5 and 6, I used to talk about development such as subdivision and land use consent. So I just want to, framing up the presentation today, just want to hone in on that. I use primarily policy 4 is the main one around management priorities. Sets up a hierarchy, so avoid significant risk where practicable. And I think the way that the panel's decisions need to sit with the Gore District Plan certainly need to take that avoid as the high bar, noting the king salmon requirements. So with the regional policy statement came out after the king salmon was issued, but there were potentially appeal points and other bits and pieces around when the date was when the decisions were released before the appeals and bits and pieces. So we think definitely avoid in the first instance, but also in that second part of that policy, it talks about mitigate the effects of natural hazards by managing land use in areas known to be susceptible to the effects of natural hazards. So where the natural hazard risk isn't significant, there still needs to be a mitigate. So we believe that the panel should be looking to prevent people going into hazard-prone locations in the first instance, knowing that there is a climate change component, which over time means that flood depth and velocity and flood impacts will get greater over time, and sending signals about upzoning or maintaining zone requirements for development rights does perpetuate risk into the future as flood risk changes. So I want to make sure that flood process is in the back of your minds as we're going through that process. Also want to talk about method natural hazard 5, H and I particularly. The regional policy statement outlines that a district plan should identify no-build, open space and reserve or low-density areas as necessary to mitigate the effects of flooding. So it certainly points towards not intensifying zoning requirements enable more dwellings or industrial use of land to be enabled in areas of risk. And it also talks about excluding some activities from areas of significant risk and natural hazards. And I guess the final point that I'm looking to make around the district plan is that particularly the definition of significant hazard risk. I note that there isn't a definition as such in the regional policy statement, but in the explanation of the policies, there's a little bit of an explanation that talks about what some of the significant risks are, but are not limited to. And I would like to think that the panel would consider also including the insurance risk. So what we're seeing at regional council level is that there's a number of companies starting to look at withdrawing insurance from properties, particularly in regard to the city area, where that natural hazard risk from an effect-based perspective is relatively low on property and people. Insurance is still looking to withdraw, and what we're looking at is recognising that significant natural hazard risk is also the loss of insurance on properties, because that has long-term social and economic well-being ramifications for residents, not only at time of building or natural hazard risk, but in perpetuity in the future, as long as that development exists on those properties. So yeah, looking for some consideration from the panel on that respect around what classifies as a significant risk for natural hazards, not just depth and flow, but also some of those other social factors around resale, limb reports, and insurance withdrawal. So looking for those considerations for the panel when they're making the decisions on zone requirements and upzoning. But I'll hand over to Gavin now to talk a little bit more around some of the aspects in the Tonkin and Taylor report.
Yeah, so the Tonkin and Taylor report, if you've read through it, I'm sure you have. So it's mapping the flood risk without flood protection in place. So it's assuming that protection isn't there. Unfortunately, the modelling that ES has had done for Gore and Mataura is still to get through our executive team and approved for release. So that, yeah, we can use that very shortly, but just not at this time. Yeah,
So when you're looking at that Tonkin and Taylor report, you've got the benefit of knowing what is sitting in that ES modelling that we can't yet see, which means that you're working from a better knowledge base at this point, and I suppose to whatever extent you can signal anything useful through this discussion that we should be aware of might be helpful.
Yeah, well, we don't disagree with what's in the Tonkin and Taylor report, because what we've modelled for breach scenarios or overtopping events. The Tonkin and Taylor mapping of risk isn't much different from what we've modelled. So you know, the assumptions for Gore and Mataura, if there is overtopping or breaches, the risk profile is quite similar between the two, well, the Tonkin and Taylor report and Environment Southland's modelling. So when you're up in that H5, H4 risk classification, you know, that's serious risk to people, vehicles and buildings. Well, H5 is buildings. So, yeah. Yeah. So one of my concerns is just, ES hasn't had modelling done, but just Mandeville is quite a complex area as far as flood risk. So there's flooding potential from Matara, but there's also the Waimea and the Odometa. So it's relatively complex. We haven't modelled it. There's the old railway embankment, which may act as a informal stop bank, which may provide some protection, but then it's not a constructed stop bank, so it could be still permeable through the railway ballast. We'd probably like to take a more detailed look at the proposed rezoning at Mandeville in time.
I guess with the Mandeville situation, it is known to be in the flood zone currently. It's just the extent to how bad it is, or how deep the flow is and how fast it's going. But I guess there's also potential with that railway embankment to hold water back, and it's coming down the other side of the catchment down the Odometa. So you want to, I used to reflect that there is a natural hazard risk in Mandeville, and panel need to be reasonably cognizant that enabling intensification zoning or upzoning in those locations is going to put more properties and more people at risk when it does flood.
So, have you been following the advice that we've had from the Section 42A officer around the reasons for that settlement zoning to pick up the existing pattern of development? Are you making a distinction between, I guess, what that zone might do for existing use versus what that zone might do for any further development?
Correct. So effectively acknowledge that there is existing development. I guess there's a permitted criteria that becomes established through recognising those zones or providing additional zones in Mandeville, and I guess it's that additional built form being established in the floodplain, I guess, is a primary concern noted in the RPS, that we want to take a precautionary approach and mitigate people from building where there is a known risk, and that risk potentially could get worse as climate change continues occurring in the future.
So that when we had that discussion this morning with the Section 42A, it was around the what the zone might do and what the rules in the natural hazard chapter might do, because obviously we know we're yet to look at the provisions in the natural hazard chapter, and there's this interrelationship, so that's part of what we're grappling with.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, we weren't able to listen to the conversations, so I understand the point around the natural hazard chapter, and certainly a chapter that we're looking to be present on and talk to reasonably thoroughly. That chapter arrives next year.
Yeah. And there's the risk mapping in the Tonkin and Taylor report, but I suppose as I mentioned before, it assumes there's no flood protection in deriving those risk ratings. But in Mandeville, there is, apart from that, the informal protection of the old railway line. There is no flood protection, and you've got three potential flood sources in the town. Yeah.
So when you said you were going to have another look at the Mandeville zoning, are you imagining responding further? I mean, the last time Mr. Roy was here for hearing stream 1, it resulted in some going away and coming back with wording and such like. To what extent were you imagining furthering this, through tabling something for us?
The specific flood modelling for Mandeville will take some time. We wouldn't be able to respond in the space of weeks. The modelling work we've got done for Gore and Matara was commissioned in January 2020, 3. So we're already 18 months from commissioning, and we get to actually finalise that document and get it released. So I know it's a pretty complex and pretty detailed model, which may not be the same sort of situation for Mandeville, but Mandeville is a complex one in the sense that there are 3 catchments to work on at once, not just one catchment.
So you're almost asking us, when you say take cognizance of, to do an assessment, but that's the planner's role and your role to make a recommendation to us. Are you actually wanting the zoning patterns to change, and where and why?
I guess we're looking to ensure that the regional policy statements are a key of avoid significant risk and mitigate other risk adequately implemented into the new district plan. So there is a mapping component of that, but there's also a precautionary approach that flooding does exist in Mandeville and Pukerau, Waikaika and Goromatara. And I guess it's a decision that needs to be made by the panel as to what level of appetite, what risk appetite is palatable, and to the extent that a precautionary approach needs to be taken. In our view, precautionary means no further intensification of development in floodplains, where they are known. If it's flooded there in the past, you don't want to be putting additional people at risk because insurance is withdrawing, and we're seeing that occurring now and predict that will continue occurring to a greater extent moving forward. And you're unnecessarily putting investment in property and people's livelihoods and economic well-being at risk by enabling development in those areas. So I'm not sure if that actually answers the question of the panel. Modelling is going to take some time, and Environment Southland is looking to model all catchments in Southland and looking to prioritise those as we can. But yeah, it's not going to be a fast approach to model flood risk in Mandeville.
I think it's useful. Oh, sorry.
Yes, we are aware of the risks at Mandeville, and we've got mapping to show that will confirm that the historical problems are not going to improve by themselves. Now, I've got a duty to test your evidence or your opinion. And I admit I'm being a little bit provocative, but your climate change, everybody refers to climate change, and you certainly are. Where are you getting your information from? Where's your background information?
Our information from the 2018 US study for Southland.
And where's NIWA getting their information from?
So NIWA's getting their information from it's a downscaled version of the National Climate Management Approach. So Gore, Southland District Council, Invercargill City Council and Environment Southland all joint commissioned NIWA to do a regional climate change impact assessment, and that was produced in 2018, which predicted that flood or rainfall intensities were going to get worse, and also drought conditions were going to get worse in Southland. So with rainfall intensity getting higher, the prediction was that flood peaks would get higher and more regular. So that's the information we're relying on for commenting on natural hazard risk and climate change moving forward.
And look, I accept that that's your professional position, and that's the information you've received, and you've passed it on to us, and we will receive it in good faith. But I would just add the point, NIWA must be going back to the IPCC assessments and modelling, and IPCC themselves would say that there's not a strong connection with CO2 levels and extreme weather events. Notwithstanding that, that doesn't negate or diminish the evidence you've given. I just had to be, I confess, a little provocative and make that point. Thank you.
So just on that NIWA study from 2018, so is this the climate change risk assessment that's required as part of climate change adaptation and what's come through the Act, the Carbon Zero Act, Climate Change Response Act?
No, it was an independently commissioned piece of work just so that councils in Southland could understand what likely impacts would be occurring in Southland. And it wasn't solely focused on coastal problems, it covered drought, snowfall, wind, frost days, extreme temperature days, covered a broad ambit of climate impacts that are likely to occur in Southland, and recognised that in northern Southland, particularly that the drier climate up there, there will be more dry days and more extreme weather days. More river levels being lower through the summer, less snow providing base flow in autumn, or spring and autumn, and ultimately with rain intensity was going to increase. So when it did start raining, there would be more rain falling over a shorter number of days, so there would be higher intensity rainfall events likely to occur.
So is there a relationship between the evidence that you're giving and our responsibilities in relation to the climate change adaptation plan? You know, we've got to pay attention to the climate change emissions reduction plan and adaptation planning. To what extent is that factoring into your evidence today?
I guess the correlation would be that natural hazard events have always occurred and will always occur. So climate change is not the culprit for natural hazard events. Effectively, the natural hazard event is always going to exist, and the climate change is going to be the degree of exponential on top of it over years. So a 1% AEP flood today may be quite different to a 1% AEP flood in 20 to 50 years' time. But decisions around zone and permitted development rights on a particular property, as soon as you enable those development rights through rule criteria, you're effectively locking in a development right for the future. And if those floods are going to continue getting worse over time, you're signalling that a certain risk appetite that is okay today in 2024 is ultimately going to be okay in some point in the future. And ultimately, I guess, when disaster strikes, and there's been a number of natural hazard events up north that have red zone properties, and some of the implications that red zoning of land and buybacks falls 50-50 back on the local authority and 50-50 back on, well, local authorities pay 50%, but central government's been paying 50% too. So likes of the Hawke's Bay and Gisborne and Auckland, the properties have been red zoned. Local authorities need to buy those out, and ultimately ratepayers.
As an example of the effects of climate change, so the February 2020 flood at Gore had an estimated flow of 2,400 cubics. So NIWA is currently reviewing that data, but so an estimated 1% or 100-year annual recurrence interval event is predicted to be 2,700 cubics. That's 300 cubics more than the 2020 flood. And the estimates for a 2% warming of the climate puts a 1% event at 3,200 cubics. So that's an extra 500 cubics of flow on the Mataura at Gore. So over time, as the climate warms, the size of a particular flood is going to, like a return period of annual exceedance probability, is going to increase.
Returning to the Tonkin and Taylor report, Are there any of the recommendations in that report that you don't agree with?
It does promote using elevated floor levels in areas at lower to mid risk. So if we use Mandeville for an example, sure that the modelling might be lower H1, H2 risk, but that's in an area with no flood protection. So you're at risk straight away, plus there's you can elevate your floor level, but you're still, particularly with modern vehicles, electric vehicles don't like being flooded. So, you know, they're write-ups after being flooded. So you've got property like that as well.
Can I ask, because there's a relationship there in the rule framework that's proposed here between the raising of the floor levels and an assessment of that 1% AEP, to what extent should planning at this point be adding a factor just the way that you've done, and how do you do that in a planning sense?
You can add that into the model. So I suppose you can model a flow with like a particular size event now, and then you can add that climate change factor to the flow that you're modelling. So.
Can I just go back to the report, and I'll be a little bit more specific. The Tonkin Taylor report recommends a not up zoning on a number of properties and leaving some the same. Are you happy with the conclusions that are reached in that regard?
Well, it's looking at rezoning in the Charlton area. So historically, that has back in the 80s, the catchment board at the time did put an option to residents to construct flood protection on the Charlton stream, and that was rejected by property owners. But then in recent times, we've had property owners calling our catchment operations team out of concerns. Essentially, there's been intensification going on in there without flood protection.
I have a question. So what are Environment Southland doing to mitigate some of the flooding as well, further upstream in the catchment?
Certainly, there's a number of things going on. I guess Environment Southland recognises that defence stopping development and installation isn't going to be the answer to a lot of these issues. Environment Southland is looking at nature-based solutions as a primary infrastructure, although it's a soft infrastructure technique to try and slow the flow. So effectively using wetlands and expanding the bed and natural environment of the river instead of trying to constrict it and speed the water up to get down catchment. We recognise that slowing the water down and flattening peaks of floods is the best approach. So there has been a body of work going on underway at the moment, the Hokonui Runanga, that are also looking to try and understand, you know, where are these, where's the best location for some of these activities, and how is it best implemented in a sense to manage the flood flow in catchment rather than trying to just send it downstream as fast as we can. But Gavin may want to add more on that. Yeah, so there's a slow flow project. Plus, there's also a gravel management program underway. So that's to address some of the concerns about the build-up of gravel in areas of the catchment. So the slow the flow project with the natural-based solution, it's likely to help with the more regular small flood events. Perhaps take a bit off the real big ones, but the big ones are still going to have an impact.
So you don't feel that the work that you're doing will mitigate any of the problems that we're looking at today in the plan?
Oh, it's, yeah, everything will help. It's a combination of solutions, nature-based solutions, gravel management, and then your hard protection infrastructure, which might be detention dams, stop banks. Yeah, we'll possibly look at bonding areas, diverting floodwater to storage areas, rather than it going straight downstream.
Yeah, and I guess Environment South recognises that prevention's better than cure, but I guess we would also temper that with enabling zoning in current flood zone locations. It's a risky process, and that precautionary approach is best exercised where we can, knowing that upstream intervention isn't going to solve all the problems, and there will be floods that come down the Mataura and other rivers in Southland, and the more we can minimise people from getting in harm's way, the easier it's going to be for the district and the region to recover and respond and be resilient to those activities in the future.
Just a question. The last large flood event, 2020, and I understand, and you alluded to it, that the water that passed through the Mataura area was the highest flow that had been recorded, and I don't know if there was much freeboard left, but I guess the question I want to know is that because the water's running down through the catchment faster? I suppose that there's been extremely heavy rain events over the last, however, 100, 200, 400 years. Is there anything changed? Farming practice, etc., gravel build-up, or a combination of the lot?
Yeah, well, I was talking to somebody who grew up on a farm in Waikaka, and he said his grandfather used to say after they were a wee bit way down the catchment, and his grandfather used to say after a big rain event it would take 3 days for the water to get down to their farm.
Yep.
Then his father was saying, well, that's a day now, and then in more recent times it's like 6 or 8 hours. So so I suppose it's that clearance of vegetation and drainage has just accelerated flow, basically. And the problem we have at Gore and Mataura is they're essentially choke points in the catchment that we're trying to squeeze a lot of water through. Constrictions in the flood protection. So.
I'd probably also add to that, there's drainage have been a permitted activity, but also soil structure and how soils have been developed. They are actually better structured, so they actually have more pores, and they're probably releasing or not holding water for so long. So, how much freeboard did we have in Mataura? Not enough.
Not much. So the freeboard at Gore was it was estimated to be a 7-year event, and our catchment ops team are basically saying that the stock bank at Gore would accommodate a 75-year return event. So it was pretty close, similar at Mataura, and of course we did have overtopping of the Boundary Creek stock bank at Mataura, which inundated some properties on the west side of the town. But that was deliberately built to a lower standard of protection as a relief valve to the main banks. So.
And I think there were also reports of the stock banks in Mataura. The water was starting to bubble up underneath them, with the hydraulic gradient between the height of being up near the stock banks was pushing up underneath the gravels underneath the stock banks. So I guess 2020 it was touch and go. Was probably a good description of how the flood system was able to cope with that event. You wouldn't want to see much more water go down there. It was skinning your teeth material, I think, was general feel around how the system coped with that event. And we know they're going to get worse moving forward, so hence, I guess, the regional policy statement taking that precautionary approach and trying to minimise people going to locations that we know currently flood, they're going to continue flooding in the future, and it's not economically viable to put stop banks in every township and continue lifting them as models suggest. Otherwise, that we need to, the risk is getting worse. So prevention is better than cure in terms of minimising the people that go into those locations, and hence the position that we're taking on the submission.
I know you haven't finished your modelling, but when you do modelling, do you model in forestry and the increase in those forestry areas, and do they potentially have a beneficial impact on slowing flows, or it's not something you look at this stage?
Yeah, well, forestry does absorb a lot of water. So that, so I suppose bulk planting of a catchment would reduce the peak runoff.
Look, I guess I'm getting off track, and I'll thank you for answering my questions.
Oh, just when you were talking about the slow the flow and the gravel management, when Hokanui Runanga were here yesterday, they were talking about the Reimagining Mataura project. Are they sort of linking up? Is that a...
Yes, yeah. So our catchment team working on that nature-based solutions project is closely linked up with the Reimagining Mataura. It's one and the same, and it's got that synergy around trying to identify sites and make sure mana whenua are on that journey and coming up with solutions and suggesting sites for intervention.
So I think what's been helpful, I want to say, for having you guys laying this evidence out for us is that because the written submission, is kind of skinny, so previously you turned up and you shared some things and it resulted in some wording coming back that was able to inform the right of reply for the officer. And because you're highlighting just banging on that point around giving effect to the RPS and how that flows through, is that something you want to sort of defer to the natural hazard chapter, or is there something we should be picking up in the rule framework, aside from the zoning matter itself, which you've also laid out very clearly for us? But I guess what we need to understand to help our decision making and to help the analysis for the Section 42A officer is, anything targeted that arises from this evidence that you've given us.
Yeah, I guess we're looking to make sure that there are sufficient rules and signals are right around how the Broad District Plan is going to manage natural hazards. So whether the rules package sits within the zones as part of the zone chapters, or whether the rules relating to development rights sit within the natural hazards chapter, we're probably not either way on it. We just want to make sure that, I guess, we submitted on each of the zone changes just to ensure that, I guess, we'd reserved our position, making sure that the actual issue of development rights in natural hazard prone locations was adequately covered, and there was enough scope to make sure that wherever the rules sat, either the natural hazard chapter or the individual zones, that the right signals were in place to manage risk moving forward.
Excuse me, can we get some clarity on the RPS, because it might help for the right of reply, if that's okay? So, Marcus, in the RPS it talks about some activities and low density development, I think, in those methods. So just to clarify, do you think the RPS is trying to avoid all activities? And if not, what does low density and some activities, those methods, what are you thinking there?
So before we jump into methods, I note that there is a policy. One of the policies talks about, I think it was number 3 or 4, talks about there's a reason for, in some instances, having development in natural hazard prone locations because there's a specific need for that development. So there's a pump station or there's a transformer or something that absolutely has to be there. So we're certainly not opposed to infrastructure being in natural hazard prone locations where it needs to be. But when we, in terms of the methods, I just want to make sure that there's existing development rights with properties, but adding new subdivisions and enabling new growth into natural hazard areas is certainly not the right way to go. So which method? Sorry for you, Chair. Were you looking at?
Sorry, so NH5, H and I, the ones you quoted before, and I guess in the context of the settlement zone, because the settlement zone might allow a range of activities beyond just residential, for example. So.
Yes, certainly, and we're not opposed to continual use. I guess it's any likelihood of intensifying investment on that land. So sheds and bits and pieces. I mean, a hay shed is probably okay if it gets wet. It's not going to cause too many problems, but there's a threshold there that starts causing problems, and the insurance risk gets too high. If insurance is going to pull out, then that starts signalling difficulty to sell and purchase those properties because people will start choosing not to invest or live in those towns because they can't get insurance, they can't get mortgages. It has a cascading effect. So I guess that's primarily changing the natural hazard industry, or how we look at natural hazards faster than Environment Southland can look at natural hazards. It's those what's happening outside of our level of influence is steering the ship faster than we can steer it. So I guess that's what's in the back of our minds around what's appropriate and what's not, is around that insurance risk, people not being able to get insurance or mortgages and not being able to buy and sell land, and therefore being stuck with assets in a location when a flood comes down and all of a sudden they've got their life's investment washed away with no saviour or no ability to rebuild or move on or shift into a protected area.
But like off and on, particularly rural properties, there's an operational need, say for like we've had people wanting to build houses in, say, the Lower Matara, or the Aotearoa district, but there's just the whole property's on the floodplain, so we have to try and mitigate the risk to the proposed dwellings, but they've got an operational need to be there, but that's different to, say, rural lifestyle subdivision, where we should be avoiding the risk.
No, but I think there's a lot to pick up in the natural hazard chapter itself, but I appreciate your points today. Kia ora.
And I anticipate a more detailed conversation too when we get to the residential zonings.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much, Marcus, Gavin, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
He was watching, I think. Says, yeah.
Neil has really taken the climate change thing. Good afternoon. Jonathan, is it?
It is.
On
Yes.
behalf of Heavy Haulage. Welcome, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me again. It's great to be able to present to the rural zones, which is our main interest with this hearing. Just checking that you can hear me okay?
Yep.
Good. So as I said, our main interest is with relocated buildings which allow the residential activities as of right, but obviously with the rural zones, there's other uses for relocated buildings such as barns, sheds, garages and workshops, that there's a good use or, a cost-effective way of perhaps reusing buildings. So I just want to point out a few points with our written submission that I'd just like to highlight and I guess reinforce to the panel there. So looking at residential activity in the rural zone, so we are concerned that the permitted activity rules for residential activity doesn't include recycled or second-hand buildings. It appears to refer to new or extended buildings, but by doing so almost it seems to exclude second-hand buildings. So that's part of our concern with the wording of those zone rules. And the other side to that is that this is because relocated buildings that are not heritage items are not included in the definition of a relocated building. So it's quite a strict definition of relocated buildings because it only refers to heritage items. So, and then combining that with our concern, which we expressed previously, that the Temp R8 controls are for temporary activities. So our concern is that between all these different rulings and wordings, that actually a standard control for relocated building in the rural zone is going to fall in the gaps. So basically, I think it's intended that the temporary activities rule would cover relocated buildings, but in our opinion, a building in the process of being relocated, it could be considered temporary, but then there's actually no need for any planning controls on the building that's either sitting on a house transporter or perhaps on temporary supports. And really, in my view, the planning controls for buildings that are being attached to a residential house or a non-residential building is really to permit the foundations for the incorporation of that building onto the site. So hardly temporary. And I was just reflecting as I was waiting on really where temporary has been used in other district plan plan controls around the country, and I can think of two. So in the New Plymouth district plan area, they refer to temporary in terms of a storage yard. So a number of house movers do have storage yards in commercial or industrial type areas, and so that I think would come more under a temporary type heading. And then the other one I can think of for the Waimak district, they've got a planning control, and it was primarily brought in for buildings or houses coming out of Christchurch following the earthquake and the need, I guess, to move them pretty rapidly to a new site. And So in their plan, what that allows is a temporary storage of individual buildings, perhaps on the site that they're going to, but on temporary stands, I think for 6 or 9 months. And to me, that's another use of what could be called a temporary activity, which is perhaps more befitting to that term. So I guess I'm saying these points to reinforce our belief that really having a district-wide control, no problem with that, but referring to it under a temporary heading is perhaps the wrong description, especially when you do read the definition of what temporary actually means. So I think I've laboured my point enough on that. So turning to looking a bit further at the Section 42A report, so for this reason we do actually disagree with the majority of the analysis of our submissions on this point, and we would argue that to aid compliance for your average property owner, house owner, that really each zone should include the performance controls related to relocated buildings in that zone. However, should the hearings panel determine that the wording is suitable in Temp R8, and that really that is a suitable control and it defines things correctly, that the addition recommended by the planner of the word relocated may assist with the compliance and understanding in each zone, and we wouldn't be opposed to that if the hearings panel sought to go that way. Really, then the final point that I'd like to make is in 3.6 of my written submission, which didn't appear to be addressed in the Section 42A report, was that we requested the definition of relocation to also include those non-heritage relocated buildings in that definition, and that would certainly help. So therefore, we request that the hearings panel direct that this definition be so amended. So those are the points that I would like to highlight for the hearings panel, and thank you for your time.
Any questions? I can say there was quite some discussion about relocated buildings, so you certainly, submission has been listened to and considered, and I believe accommodated, but we'll obviously go back and have another look at it, considering the points you've made. I particularly take your point about temporary buildings that are perhaps placed in storage until they are relocated permanently, in which case we consider them as a new build. Would you put a time limit on that? But
yeah, I don't know. It's listen. I guess that's subject to the sale and purchase arrangements that house movers have with their clients. I guess so, some buildings, especially the character-orientated ones, seem to go quite quickly. Other ones, which are, shall we say, more functional, do sometimes sit in a particular yard, but. I don't know, for example, the New Plymouth one that I talked about is one actually of the few district council plans around the country to actually have a planning control for storage yards, but from my memory they didn't set a time limit on that. Yeah.
I think we have got provisions that you can't locate a relocatable building without, continue to work on it and take it to completion. So that wouldn't be considered a temporary structure as such. So I guess most or all of those temporary storage will be in the yard of an operator who will have the specialist machinery to shift it. So those places will be few and far between.
Yes, I'm not 100% sure, but I don't know there's any within your council boundaries. There are probably some in adjacent council council areas. Yeah.
Yes, I can think of one south of here.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
so I guess for the authors of the reports, the issue of a house being stored temporarily on a section, either being the section that it's going to or on a different one, be it a yard or whatever, has that issue been thought about? And really, how does it differ from rural contractors who put huge piles of gravel all over the place before starting to build a road?
In relation to houses being stored in a yard or such activities, I'd consider this would probably fall under the definition of an industrial activity, and therefore if it's occurring where it's appropriately zoned, I don't doubt that those activities wouldn't be covered by other provisions in the plan. So therefore, I don't think it needs anything more specific than that. If I may respond to the definition of relocation, it does reference buildings which are not related to heritage. I'm not sure whether potentially the submitter's looking at a previous version of the plan, perhaps the draft plan, but that definition does include, in relation to other buildings which are not heritage buildings, means the removal, relocation or resiting of an existing building from any site to another site, excluding the movement of building within the same title or a new building built off-site that has then been used and transferred to a site. So I think our definitions are covering hopefully what the submitter wishes them to. In relation to residential activity in the rural zone, we have included any new extended or relocated building in an attempt to achieve that permitted activity status for relocated buildings. And I just maintain my position about the temporary activities rule for temporary buildings, but happy to take questions.
So when a new house is going up on a site and there's sheds and other things there, is that process a temporary activity?
No, I don't consider that it is. I think, the temporary activities rule is specifically about relocated buildings. It's a belt and braces approach, I guess, so that you have a hook in the plan if you do have problems arising with buildings that have been relocated to sites and they're not installed permanently.
So what provisions are under the Building Act to cover that situation if the work is not completed? So which is the better mechanism, the planning, the district plan or the Building Act?
I suspect that the Building Act probably isn't concerned with things like amenity or streetscape or anything in that respect. It's probably more to do with the health and safety aspect. It's outside of my area in terms of commenting on what the Building Act's trying to achieve or wants to achieve. We did sort of traverse this in the previous hearing stream in relation to what's required under the Building Act versus what's required under the district plan. And as I said, it's my opinion that the rule is necessary in our plan in terms of being available for use if we are in a situation where a building has been relocated to site and not reinstated. But yeah, in relation to what the Building Act manages and what the district plan manages, I think we are managing two different things in relation to that amenity side of things.
So under the RMA, there's also the option available to council in terms of nuisance activities or enforcement provisions where a site is unsightly. Is that another technique that might be available? So I'm just thinking through what are the options to what these guys are promoting in terms of where it sits in the plan, and if there's a technique in terms of nuisance that Mr. Garbutt's no doubt going to respond to, is that something that under Section 32 we should be looking at?
Yeah, I can comment from the legal point of view in the sense that I don't think unsightly is necessarily an enforceable action. You've got to breach a plan rule or a consent. I mean, there are general duties, but they're not enforceable per se. So just because something looks a bit ugly doesn't mean council can necessarily do anything about it. And there'll be multiple examples of that. If I just comment on the Building Act, the Building Act is just simply trying to ensure a structure is to code and that's it. It's binary. It's either complies with code or it doesn't. That's the sole function of the Building Act. So I do support what the officer says about the RMA has quite different focuses in terms of not just amenity but site location and density and all the other usual requirements on establishing, say, a dwelling or other structure on a site. That's all I want to say. The submitter may have something to say too.
Yeah, perhaps if I may just add, so I think probably under the planning control, so there are, with those performance standards that are there, so being on foundations in 2 months and completely reinstated in 12, I believe that there probably are notices to fix that could be issued under various enforcement activities.
That actually segues to my question in terms of, because we've got a permitted activity standard, and I was wondering to myself, what happens if that standard is not met, mostly thinking about time frame, and then is that, because presumably you don't meet the permitted activity standard, you head off into a resource consent pathway ordinarily, and I thought to myself, would someone undertake a precautionary resource consent because they don't think they're going to make the 12 months? Well, I was just trying to imagine how that would work. So I think you've provided an answer in terms of a notice to fix in relation to the permitted activity standard. But I guess where the standard is breached, it would trigger a resource consent process. So had you thought that through at all?
Yeah, so in our experience, I mean, these controls are pretty widespread around the country now. Typically what happens, I think, because the foundation, I mean, to me that's the most obvious thing, or step to say that, hey, listen, nothing's happened with the building or something's happened with the building, right? Because if it's up there and it's on temporary supports still after 2 months, then that's not a good sign, right? Excuse me. But what typically happens is obviously there's a building consent associated with this, because that's the new works, and therefore when that process is undertaken, then typically there'll be a building inspector that will come along and actually inspect the foundations, make sure the holes are of good standing and all that sort of thing, right? So I think in our experience what's happened, because you've only got 2 months to do it, then that's something that typically happens very quickly. Also, the most common practice around the country is that the house relocation company undertakes that work as soon as practicable. So as soon as that house gets to the site, that it's put on foundations. It's far more unusual for that not to happen straight away. So to me, that's a really great way of the building inspectors actually coming to the site, seeing where the building's up to, obviously having engagement with the contractor, with the house owner, and making sure that that's all underway. And so to me that's the most substantial, most obvious part of a building being reinstated into a site is, yes, it's on permanent foundations, and then obviously the next stage is the services, your plumbing and water and all that sort of thing. So I think that in our experience there haven't been too many of these where they've got a bit waylaid. Typically, once I think the building inspectors are aware of a building being on site, that I guess it's a bit more of ad hoc is probably the wrong term, but I guess informal way of the building inspector, keeping an eye on that building and seeing that it's up, it's progressing, shall we say, into its reinstated sort of process. If it doesn't, then I guess, once again, the inspectors have seen that, and therefore they can take appropriate action if necessary.
It will come up later, I think, when we're considering temporary activities, but I see there's a limit of 50 square metres for all structures that are on the site. Have you lodged a submission to that? Because a temporary, a relocated building would be bigger than 50 square metres.
Can you give us a reference?
on page 328 of the plan.
I think you might be referring to temp R2 as opposed to temp R8.
Oh, so I'm looking at temporary buildings and structures associated with construction.
Yes.
Right, so that comes back to the other question I asked then about the builder sheds and everything else. They're covered by that rule. So there is a rule for when there's a new house going up. So they're being treated the same, although the standards are different.
Yes, they're managed in the same chapter, but the
Yes.
standards are different.
Yeah.
Under the operative district plan, the relocated buildings does fall under temporary activities as well. So in terms of, I guess maybe from a plan usability relating to the district, currently the temporary activities rule for relocation of structures falls under temporary activities in the operative district plan. That's just an addition.
Okay, that's all for me, thanks.
Any more questions? Okay, thank you very much for your involvement today, and we'll consider your points, and I'm sure you'll be watching the outcome of future sections. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your time.
So the next one we've got at 3:30 is Federated Farmers. Are they online now?
I can turn it on, just wait for them, because it'll pop up if they're waiting to be admitted. So you can continue on until they come on, because they're scheduled for 3:30.
Yeah. I need to really come to a stop. I'm sorry.
We've got quarter of an hour until Federated Farmers submit, so we'll adjourn for